Welcome everyone to Daf Yomi 1 week at a time, Masechet Bava Metzia. This is our last class of this Masechet. This is the 17th class. So those of you who have been with us from the beginning of this Masechet, this is our 17th class. And today we are going to be reviewing Daf 13 through Daf 19. And very exciting, we are going to be finishing this Masachet. So let's begin. We're a little bit down on Daf 113 at the Mishnah. And today we're going to be talking about taking a collateral for a loan and what happens with that collateral. So I'm putting up, these are the verses that we are going to be discussing. So you can read it on your own, and the Mishnah and then the Gemara are going to discuss these verses. So the Mishnah tells us that you can only collect a collateral, a mashkon, with permission of the court. You can't decide that you need to take this collateral on your own. It's only done with the permission of the court. And the lender is not allowed to go into the borrower's home and take the collateral, right? The verse says you have to stay outside, right? Bachutz ta'amod, you have to stand outside, and then the borrower is going to bring out the security, the mashkon. If the borrower had two utensils that are equal to the value of the loan, and here the Mishnah is describing a person who is very poor, and they basically have pajamas, right, a nightgown for at night, and they have a work outfit for the day. So the Mishnah tells us that you can only take one of these things at a time, and you have to return, right, the pajamas you have to return at night so that this person has something to sleep in, and the day clothes you have to return during the day so that they have something to wear in the morning. Obviously, we're talking about very poor people, and the lender has to be sensitive to their predicament. So the Mishnah describes a reality where the lender needs to have some sort of security for the loan, but the borrower needs to actually use these things on a day-to-day basis. And the Mishnah tells us that the lender has to bring back this item every single day. Because again, we want to be sensitive to both the borrower and the lender. If the borrower dies, the lender does not need to return the security to the heirs, right? He can keep it as payment for his loan. After 30 days of returning this security every single day, the court can allow the lender to sell this item and keep the money, right? Again, the lender is owed this money, and as a favor, he's giving it back every day. But after 30 days, he's allowed to sell it and get the money. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to describe exactly what happens. The court will appoint an agent to go and get this mashkon, this collateral from the borrower. And now the question is, can this agent go into the house, or does he also have to stand outside? So the Gemara says that the agent is allowed into the house. It's the lender that is not allowed to go into the house. The verse implies that the lender has to stand outside, but the agent is allowed to go in and get the collateral. Or maybe the lender and the agent need to stand outside, and it's the borrower who is going to bring it out. Okay, there is a machloket if, as we said, if the agent can go in or not. And okay, so that's that machloket. The Gemara now continues and tells us that you cannot take the mashkon, the security, that you cannot take security from a utensil that's used for food preparation. so again, we have to understand the psychology behind this Gemara, right? The lender wants to take something that is owned by the borrower, but if it's going to prevent the borrower from living his regular normal life, that's not okay, right? So he can't take his pots and his pans. We'll see other things he's not allowed to take. He's also not allowed to take his bed and his blanket. He could take, if there are like guest bedroom beds, he's allowed to take those. He might even be allowed to take the beds of his wife and his children. But we'll get back to that. If he's rich, you're allowed to leave 2 beds for him. If he's poor, you leave, right, the bed that he's sleeping on, plus another one. What's going on here? So the Gemara explains that they had 1 bed for sleeping and 1 bed for eating, right? So I guess you can call it like a lounge area, right? So you need to leave the eating bed and the sleeping bed. As we said, you're allowed to sell the security after 30 days. Now, the question is, what do we do when he sells it? Do we say that he has to buy something cheaper and then return that to the person, right? Or no, because, and we've seen this before, the Gemara says all Jews are seen as bnei milachim, right? All Jews are princes, right? Sons of kings, and therefore they deserve expensive things or the best things, and therefore you can have the security and you sell it after 30 days. And in the meantime, you can't sell it and give him something cheaper. You actually have to return it every single day. If the item is very fancy, maybe you can buy a cheaper item. Again, right? If he has a gold pitcher, right? So maybe we say, listen, you don't really need a gold pitcher, and maybe you can sell it for a cheaper item. Daf 114 tells us that the lender has a responsibility to take care of the borrower, right? Again, I think that it's such a powerful message. We always think about people who are money lenders, and they're seen as very low people, right? And here the Gemara says, if you're going to lend somebody money, you also need to take care of him, right? And that's exactly what our Gemara is teaching. And therefore, you're not allowed to take necessary items, right? The verse says, Ulecha tihiyet daka, right? You see it here, the second verse, right? You have to do a charitable act. And the charitable act is making sure that the borrower has what he needs. Okay. Another thing that the Gemara brings up that seems to be parallel is when a person takes an oath to donate a certain amount of money to the temple. What he says is, instead of saying, I'll give $100, he says, I'm going to give, right? I'm going to give my value to the temple. Now, let's say he realizes, oh, wait a minute, I didn't realize that means 50 shekel, right? The Torah actually gives set standard prices, right? It's not about like your health, and it's not about your profession. It's actually your age, and it's a very set price. Let's say the person can't afford that amount. So what do? So the Gemara tells us that we assess the items in his possession, and then we sell all the expensive things, and then we give him cheaper ones, right? So this seems to be a formula, and the Gemara asks, if we do that for giving charity, what about for a security for a loan? Do we do the same thing or no? So the Gemara says, no. When we're dealing with giving money to the temple, we'll do this like assessment. But when we're talking about a loan, you do not sell the items. If it's something that's necessary, we leave it. If it's not necessary, he can take it, but he has to return it every single day. However, um, excuse me. However, with paying for the temple, you do not have to return that security when he needs it. And therefore there is a difference between erchin, this vow to give money to the temple, and when we take a loan. We now have a very interesting story of Rabba Bar Avuha, who sees Eliyahu, Elijah the prophet, and he basically asks him questions, right? Elijah is the one in the Gemara who answers all of our unknown, all of our questions. So he asks him, do we assess the possessions when dealing with a creditor? And Eliyahu says, no, we do not assess. Again, as we mentioned, you take the security, but you have to return it every single day. And since he's already asking questions, the Gemara continues. He also says, the Gemara prefaced the story by saying that Rabba Bar Avuha was actually standing in a cemetery. And then he says to Eliyahu, wait a minute. There is a tradition that Elijah, is really Pinchas HaKohen. Right? Pinchas, who we're going to see in a few weeks in the Parsha. Pinchas is seen as a zealot. So there seems to be this understanding that maybe Pinchas really is, right, Eliyahu. We don't have a story that says that Pinchas dies. Maybe he didn't die. Maybe he, resurfaces as Eliyahu Hanavi, and we know that he doesn't die. So it seems to be a little complicated, but the point of the story is that if he's Pinchas, if you remember, is a priest. He's a Kohen. And if he's a priest, we know that the priest is not allowed to stand in a cemetery, right? He's not allowed to become impure. So Eliyahu says, don't you know, we're standing in a non-Jewish cemetery, and a non-Jewish cemetery is not impure. When we talk about impurity, it's only for Jews, not for non-Jews. And then he says to him, why don't you know this law? So Rabba Bar Avuha says, look, I'm really poor, and I've only had enough money to study certain areas of the Jewish law, and I didn't have enough money to focus on this area of purity and impurity. One could say maybe it's a little esoteric. One could say it's a little less practical. So he says, look, I didn't have any money to pay for the study. So what happens? Eliyahu takes him up to the Garden of Eden, to Gan Eden, and he says, fill up your cloak with these leaves from the garden. They're worth a lot of money, and then you'll be very rich. But then he realized that he was using up his merit, right? Rabba Bar Avuha says, I don't want to use up my merit to be rich in this world. I want to make sure that I have merit for the next world. So he actually dumps out all of the leaves, and he comes down to earth. But the Gemara says his cloak still smelled like the Garden of Eden. We know that there's a tradition that there's this very beautiful or powerful smell of the garden. So his cloak smells of that. So he actually takes it and sells it for a lot of money. So he's able to get a lot of money. But then he says, I don't want to rely on this great miracle. So he actually gives his money to his son-in-law because he doesn't want to benefit from it. So I think it's just a fascinating story on many different levels, and you can all think about the lessons we can glean from this story. Okay, let's go back to our borrower and the lender. If the borrower is rich, so then he doesn't have to return the security every night. However, it's important to realize that the lender is not allowed to use the security, right? So let's say he takes a fur coat, right? So he's not allowed to put it on and walk around with that fur coat. You can take the security, you put it in the safe, and you're not allowed to touch it. If the borrower gave the lender a security, he doesn't have to return it. Again, he doesn't have to return it every night because this is where the borrower gave it without being forced to give it. As we said, right, if it's a daytime garment, it needs to be returned during the day. If it's a nighttime garment, it needs to be returned for the nighttime. And if the borrower gave the security and then he died, the lender is allowed to come and take it from the heirs, right? He's really owed that security and he's allowed to take it from the children. Okay, Daf 115. If there is a security, right, then Shemitah does not cancel out that loan. If you remember, we have learned this in the past, that in general, the Shemitah year, the 7th year, the sabbatical year, cancels loans that happened before that 7th year. However, if there is this security, so then the loan is not canceled. Even if the security is returned to the borrower, the Shemitah still does not cancel the loan, and then the lender can go and take it back. We said you cannot go into the borrower's house, but you are allowed to go into the guarantor's house, right? On every loan, there is a guarantor who signs, right? A co-signer of the loan. So that person says that they'll be responsible. So the security can be taken from them instead of from the borrower. However, the Gemara does tell us that if a person owes a worker certain fees or wages, they are allowed to go into his home to take money that is owed to them. So that's the difference between a loan and a security and wages and fees. Okay, let's go to the next Mishnah. It says that if there's a widow who is the borrower, so whether she's rich or she's poor, you are not allowed to take a security from her. This is based on the verse because we do not want, well, we'll see in a minute. The Gemara is going to discuss. So the Gemara says maybe it's only, right, maybe the rich widow, you're allowed to take the security. Why? Because if the woman is poor, you need to return it every single day. Now, it's going to look really bad if this guy is coming to her house every single day. Therefore, we say you're not allowed to take the security from the widow. Now, we could say maybe only if she's poor, because that's when he has to go back every day. But if she's rich, he doesn't have to go back and return it every single day. So maybe he could take a security from the rich widow. So now the Gemara asks, based on this discussion, do we define a mitzvah based on the reason behind it or no? Right? Meaning, what did we just say? You are allowed to take a security for a loan. However, you know that if the person is poor, you have to return that security every day. So now the Gemara says, right, again, if you don't look at the reason, so then you can't take the security from any widow, right? Meaning if we get rid of the idea behind it, we could just say you're not allowed to take security from a widow, period. But if we look deeper and we say, what's the reason? So then maybe we could say, you can't take it from the poor widow, but you can from the rich widow. And therefore, the Gemara says, based on this, we can decide if we look at the reason or not, right? So too, another similar idea is there's a law that the king is not allowed to have many wives, right? But there's a reason for that, right? The king is not allowed to have too many wives because they're going to influence him badly. Therefore, if they're good, maybe it's okay, right? Or no, right? So the Gemara says the truth is that this case is different because the verse actually gives the reason for um, for this mitzvah, right? It says we're concerned that if you have too many wives, they're going to influence you. Therefore, even if you have one bad wife, that's not good, right? If she's going to influence you, that is not good either. Okay, next Mishnah on Daf 115. If the lender takes the millstone as a security, so that is very bad, right? The millstone is the way they ground the grain. And as we know, a millstone has two parts, right? The lower part, right? That's where you put the grain. And then the upper part, which is what grinds it. Because it has two separate parts, you're actually transgressing two separate transgressions, right? Because you took two utensils that were necessary for food preparation. Again, and here the Mishnah tells us you're not allowed to take anything for food preparation. And now the Gemara explains, right? You can't take the lower half. And again, if you took the top or the bottom, you again have transgressed double. Okay. And here the Gemara here discusses how do I see when you take two separate parts, is it that you've transgressed double or just once? So the Gemara brings another example when we're talking about the offering for Pesach, right? The Korban Pesach. It says you're not allowed to eat it partially raw and you need to roast it. So the Gemara discusses how many isurim, how many transgressions you have done if you eat it raw, right? Because you eat it raw and you didn't eat it roasted. And here we have a concept in Aramaic. It's called lav shebichlaalot. A lav means a negative commandment, and klalot means like kolel, a generalization, right? So if we have a general prohibition, right? Does it add to the other individual prohibitions, right? So are you getting punished for each one of those things or not? Okay, Daf 116 tells us that if the lender took scissors as a security, again, scissors are made out of two blades, right? So it's two blades. Even though it makes one utensil, it has two parts. Therefore, it is two negative commandments. So too, if you took the yoke of a cow, it also has two parts. And as we said, the millstone also has two parts. The lender, we said the lender needs to give back the butcher's knife because it's part of food preparation, or you can tell the borrower to give him the value of the knife, right? So again, the question is he giving the utensil or the money, right? Things that are usually borrowed or rented, you do not believe the person who says that he bought it, right? Again, if I can borrow something from you, so then you have to be very careful because you could say, what are you talking about? I bought that from her. I didn't borrow it. So, right, if it's something that people lend, you have to be very careful and you do not believe the person to say that they bought it. But with a butcher's knife, this is what we were talking about before, that's something that can get nicked and ruined, and therefore people don't usually lend this out. Therefore, the borrower needs to pay the lender the value of the knife. Otherwise, the lender can say he bought it from the borrower and he wants to keep it. With that, we finished the 9th chapter. And now we are going to do the final chapter of Bava Metzia. So this is actually going to be a good segue into the next Masachet. We are going to be talking about property rights, people who live together, and what are the rights that they have for themselves and to each other. Okay, so, sorry, 1 second. Okay, the Mishnah tells us there was a house, and then there's a second floor to this house, and it's owned by two separate people, right? So we have the downstairs person and the upstairs person. Now, the house fell down. Don't worry, nobody was hurt. But the question is, what do we do with all the rubble, right? So we equally divide all the stones and all the wood, right? Because in a two-story house, each person has half of the building material. If one person recognizes his stones, so then he's allowed to take his stones. And the Gemara is going to explain what's going on. So now the Gemara says, first of all, what happened to this house? Did it collapse or was it knocked over? Why is that important? Because if it collapsed, there was a problem with the lower stones, which means that those are probably broken. And if the upper stones are probably whole because the building just came down. But if it was hit from something on top, then the top stones are going to be the broken ones, and the bottom ones are whole. And therefore, maybe we would say, right, again, based on how it happened, right, you take all the broken ones, and I'm taking all the whole ones. So the question is, why does the Mishnah say that you actually split all of the stones? So the Gemara says that really the building fell in the middle of the night, and we don't know how it fell, and that's why we're going to divide all the stones equally. We said if one of the person says, these are my stones, and the other person says, I don't know, I don't recognize it, so then he's allowed to take it. Again, because he can't swear, he doesn't really know, therefore the other person is allowed to take it. So let's say the case is there were 200 stones in this building. 100 of them were broken and 100 of them are whole. So each person gets 50 of each, right? You get 50 broken, 50 whole. You get 50 broken and 50 whole. Now, if the person recognizes his stones, so then it becomes included in his broken stone allotment, or maybe it gets put in as his whole stone allotment. And that's a machloket in the Gemara. Okay, the next Mishnah tells us that, again, it's a two-story house. And in this case, it's owned by one person, and a person is renting the upper floor. And now the floor of the second floor, right? The floor of the upper apartment breaks. So if the owner doesn't fix it, the renter is allowed to move in to the downstairs apartment, right, till the owner fixes the floor. Or no, the owner fixes his ceiling, right? And then the renter has to put the plaster, right, which is like the upper layer on the floor. Which seems to imply that the first opinion is that the owner has to fix the whole thing. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to discuss this case, right? Now, first of all, we said that the floor broke. How much of it broke, right? So is it that a majority of the floor fell in, meaning the apartment is not livable, therefore that's when he can move in? Or do we say even if 4 tfachim, right? Even if it's like this much of the floor is ruined, even then he's allowed to move downstairs, right? And the Gemara says it's not fair to ask someone to live half upstairs, half downstairs, and therefore maybe he could just move in downstairs. Okay, right, so again, let's say this person rented this floor, If it fell in, maybe you'd say, oh, too bad, this apartment is broken, you can't live here anymore. We say no, right? The agreement was that if it collapses, you get to move downstairs. Okay, now DAF 117 asks us, right, does the second floor person move in with the downstairs people, or do they actually kick out the downstairs people? Right? If you're not going to fix my floor, I'm moving into your apartment and you get to go to your parents' house, right? Or you get to go to the hotel, right? You need to leave, right? And then the Gemara continues. We're going to have a lot of questions and we don't necessarily have all the answers. Then the question is, if he moves in downstairs, can he use the front door? Because now he's living downstairs. Or does he need to go upstairs and then figure out a way to get downstairs, because that was the way he used to get into his apartment. Now, another question. Let's say the building had 3 floors. So let's say the renter lived in the second floor apartment. Can the owner tell him to move into the 3rd floor, right? Don't move into my ground floor, move up one. Right? So can we say, like, oh, I only wanted to be on the 2nd floor and I don't want to walk up an extra flight of stairs, so you can't make me move up, so therefore I'm moving down. Okay. We said the second opinion in the Mishnah was that both the upper and the lower floor people need to jointly fix the ceiling. So the question is, what does that mean? So they have to put in boards or maybe reeds. This is all based on the custom of the area. You have to see what the custom of the area is for floor construction, and that's what you have to do. The upper floor person needs to fix the sealant between the 2 floors. But again, the downstairs person is the one who has to structurally make sure that there is a ceiling / floor. Okay. So now let's say water leaks through to the downstairs apartment, right? Who pays, right? Does the damager need to pay, right? Or the damaged party needs to prevent the damage, meaning who has to put in the sealant? The upstairs person to make sure that there are no leaks, or the downstairs person to make sure that there's no damage even when there is a leak. And this is actually a machloket of who has the liability. Again, we're going to see in a minute. Obviously, if someone directly damages the other person, obviously they're responsible. But if it's indirect, who is responsible? That's basically what the Gemara is explaining. Another issue, that was damage. Another issue is who's responsible for strengthening the ceiling, right? If the plaster strengthens the ceiling, so then the lower person has to do that. If it's just about making it smooth and nice, so then the upper person needs to do it. And again, as I said, right, direct damage, a person who causes direct damage for sure has to fix it. But if it's indirect, so then it's the lower person who has the responsibility to fix it. Okay, next Mishnah. Now we have a house owned by 2 people and it fell down. Don't worry, no one got hurt. Lower floor person doesn't want to rebuild, right? Upper floor person wants to rebuild. What do we do? So the upper floor person is allowed to build 1 floor. He can live in it. And then if a lower floor guy wants, he can come and say, I'll give you all the expenses that you put out to build this apartment. And now, right, you build upstairs. That's opinion number 1. The next opinion is no, the upper person has to build the whole building, meaning the 2 floors, and then he can live downstairs. And then he gets paid for his expenses. And because if not, what's the issue? If you just build one floor, it looks like you're living in this apartment rent-free because, again, he didn't own a garden apartment. He owned a second floor apartment. And now he's living in the garden apartment, which belongs to garden apartment guy. And therefore, because that's not okay, he might have to build both apartments, obviously to be compensated for the downstairs one. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to explain, right, what was that thing at the end that we just said? The Gemara says you're not allowed to benefit, again, this is one opinion, you're not allowed to benefit from a person's property without paying for it and without their knowledge. So that was the case that we just had. There's another case where, and we've seen this case a few times, where a person dyes the wool the wrong color, right? The dyer does it the wrong color. He needs to pay for it. And he needs to return the wool. He's not allowed to keep it for himself. Maybe we said, right, you can't live in the downstairs apartment, but maybe not because of this issue. Maybe it's because you're going to be ruining the walls of the apartment, right? The walls get blackened from the oven and the heater, right? So there's wear and tear, and that's why he doesn't want you living in his house. And not because you're not paying rent. Okay, let's say the people they decide that they're both going to rebuild, but they want to rebuild in a different way. So now the Gemara says, if the person if the downstairs person rebuilds his part and makes a change, but it's going to strengthen the foundation of the building, so then it's okay. But he's not allowed to do something that's going to weaken the building, right? And the Gemara gives different examples. It's actually, if you're interested in building materials of the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, this is a great Gemara, right? It talks about hewn stones versus non-hewn stones, right? They're wider, right? So obviously a wider base is stronger for the building. If it's already, right, chiseled out, so then it's narrower, so it's going to be weaker, right? If you use half-size bricks versus full-size bricks, you would think that the full-size bricks are better, but actually the half-size bricks are better because they would actually put them in, right? It was this way, right? They'd put a half a brick and a half a brick. I'm talking about the depth of the wall, and then they would fill the inside with cement. That's much stronger than just putting one width of one brick. What about, right, stronger wood for the ceiling versus weaker wood? Windows, right? We don't think about it this way because nowadays most houses have support beams. So you can do whatever you want in the wall. It's the support beam that's holding up the building. But actually, interestingly, our apartment was built in the very early 70s in Israel, and construction was not the way it is now. Our apartments were built in basically like this, like the Gemara is talking about, where the walls of the apartment supports the walls of the apartment above. So therefore, if you want to make a window in your wall, right, an external wall, if you want to make a window, you are weakening the wall. That is very dangerous for your apartment upstairs. So that is actually something that we dealt with when we wanted to do construction, and it's interesting that it's a 2,000-year-old problem. So you are not allowed to add windows if they weren't there beforehand, and you're not allowed to make your ceiling taller, but you are allowed to make your ceiling shorter. Now, flip all of these things that we just said for the upper person, right? The upper apartment is allowed to make his apartment lighter or weaker, right? Because it puts less pressure on the downstairs apartment. So if he wants to use, if he wants to use, right, I don't want to say weaker, but lighter. If he wants to use lighter materials, that's okay. If he wants to use stronger materials, it's not okay. Okay, if let's say now, so that was, we rebuilt right? Each one of these cases is like a progression. That was rebuilding it with a change. Let's say they both say, we don't want to rebuild, right? Nobody wants to rebuild. So they decide they're going to sell the property. The Gemara discusses, does the upper apartment have rights to the property that the building is sitting on? And the Gemara, right? So one opinion is no, right? It's owned by the lower person, and if you sell the property, he gets everything. Another opinion is that the lower person gets 2/3 of the price and the upper person gets 1/3. And the last opinion is 3/4 and 1/4. And the Gemara concludes that it's actually 2/3, 2/3, 1/3. Okay, next Mishnah. There was an olive press that was built into a rock, like into the mountain. And then another person built a garden on top of the olive press. Now the roof of the olive press falls in. The gardener is allowed to plant in the olive press, right, till the owner of the press builds the roof, right? So this is a parallel discussion. If a wall or a tree on private property falls into the public domain, the owner is exempt, meaning if it was a totally healthy tree and a totally, good wall, and it just happened to fall down, you're not responsible. But if the court told him to cut down the tree or take down the wall within 30 days, and it fell before 30 days, he's also exempt because he had 30 days. If it's after 30 days, so then he is liable. Let's say a person's wall fell into his neighbor's garden. So the wall, right? So now, sorry, 1 second. Okay, I'm getting very excited. It's the end of the Masechet. Okay, we have a wall that falls into the garden. Okay, each one is owned by a different person. So we're going to have wall guy and garden guy. It could also be girl, but it's easier to say guy. I don't know why. Okay, so 1 second. Okay, right. So the person's wall falls into the neighbor's garden. Okay, so the wall person, we'll say person, wall person tells garden person, right, you keep all the stones. Now, if you've ever had, right, stones fall into your yard, you don't want to have to clean it up, right? So we don't have to listen to wall person. The garden person can make the wall person clean up all the stones in that person's garden. However, if the garden person is like, oh, I actually need these rocks, great, I'll take them, and he clears it away, the garden person is not, the wall person is not allowed to come afterwards and say, oh, you know what? I'll give you $100. Can you give me back the stones? Right? You don't have to give it back. Obviously, if it's a good deal, you can do it. But if you don't want to, you do not have to take that offer. Okay. And a similar case on Daf 118, if you hired a worker to gather straw, you cannot force the worker to take the straw as payment, right? The employer has to pay in cash. If you had an agreement beforehand, that's great. But if you didn't, you have to pay in cash. Let's say the worker decides to take the straw. Afterwards, you're not allowed to force him to sell it back to you. That's not okay. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to explain. Again, we had the case of the olive press and the roof and the garden. We ask, right, did the majority of the roof fall in, or even 4 tfachim? Again, parallel discussion. Do we say, right, you could still plant some of it on top and some of it below, or not? Right, again, maybe for living partially upstairs and partially downstairs, that's not okay, but maybe you can have a garden a little bit upstairs and a little bit downstairs, maybe that's okay. We said that the owner of the stones says you can keep the stones. And then the question is, did the garden acquire the stones? Only if the garden person agrees and wants them. If that's the case, so then his garden already acquired the stones. Maybe the worker is different. Again, the worker with the straw, maybe the worker is different because it's his wages. And therefore, maybe he needs to take whatever the employer is giving him. We say no, the employer needs to pay him in cash. Okay, but if the worker works for the employer's friend, maybe then he can be paid in straw. And then we say no, again, the worker always gets paid in cash. If the worker, what if the worker was just watching the straw? He didn't really work with it. You can pay him in straw. And then the question is, does he acquire the straw just by watching it, or does he actually have to pick it up? Okay, second to last Mishnah. The Mishnah says, if a person puts fertilizer, again, which is probably animal dung, he puts it into the public domain, a person must take it away. You're not allowed to leave it in the public domain, right? We know it can cause damage. That brings us back to Baba Kama, if you remember our damages. You're not allowed to soak clay in the public domain because it takes a long time to soften. And therefore, we don't want you to leave it there for a long time. You're not allowed to make bricks in the public domain. Also, it takes a long time for it to dry. But you are allowed to knead clay in the public domain. Apparently, that's something that is very quick. If you're building in the public domain, if you're building on private property, but very close to the public domain, you're allowed to bring the stones and put them in the street because you're going to be using them right away. But if it causes damage, you are liable. Or maybe you can even prepare up to 30 days before the construction, and then you would not be liable. Okay, that's the Mishnah. So now the Gemara is going to discuss. You are allowed to leave the fertilizer in the public domain for 30 days to make it better. This is what's called to improve the quality of life in Israel, right? Everyone has fields. Everyone wants to have the best fertilizer. So we say that you're okay. You are allowed to leave it out there for 30 days. Apparently, if people walk in it, it makes it better. And you are exempt from damage because you had permission to leave it there, or maybe no, you have permission, but you're not allowed to cause damage. And therefore, if you do cause damage, you are liable. Let's say a stone cutter gave a stone to the person who's going to smooth the stone. So then that last person is going to be liable. And the Gemara goes through each step, right? Then he gives it to the donkey driver who's going to deliver it. So then he becomes liable for the stone. Then he gives it to the porter. He's liable. Then he gives it to the builder. Then he gives it to the master builder. So now, if the stone falls out of the wall, all of them are liable because maybe, right, someone in that process didn't do a good job, or no, only the last guy is liable because he's the one who gave them all of the permits, right? The inspector who came and said everything was okay, maybe he's the one who is liable. Okay, last Mishnah of this Masechet, we have a case of two gardens, an upper garden and a lower garden, right? A lot of Israel is on the mountain. So we have an upper garden and a lower garden. You have vegetables. So you have things growing in the top and things growing in the bottom. But now something starts growing out of the middle, right? Something that's like coming parallel to the ground. So the question is, does it belong to the upper garden or does it belong to the lower garden, right? And each person is going to say, wait a minute, it's there because of my dirt, right? My dirt is on the top, and you're like, no, my dirt is on the bottom, right? So each one can prevent the other one from taking this produce. So the Mishnah says we have to see where it's growing from, right? Where is it getting its nutrients, right? Is it getting its nutrients from the upper garden or from the lower garden? Or no, right? As long as the upper guy can reach it from his garden, then it's his. And anything he can't reach, then it's the lower person's property. My husband told me something beautiful about this Mishnah, but I want to finish the Gemara and then we'll go back to the Mishnah. I'll give you I thought it was a beautiful idea. But the Gemara explains, like on a technical level, right? The roots belong to the upper garden. And the branches and the vegetable go according to the root, and therefore it's the upper person. Or no, it's growing in the airspace of the lower garden, and therefore it's his, right? And there's a Braita that talks about the person who owns the land versus the person who owns a tree, right? What's making the produce grow, right? Obviously, the tree is making the produce grow, but the nutrients are coming from the land. So who owns the produce? Right, the tree owner or the land owner? Okay, last daf, 119. It's very short, right? So too with Orla, right, with the mitzvah of not being able to benefit from the first 3 years of a fruit tree. So the new tree grows out of the trunk or out of the roots, right? So if you have a new growth that's coming out of the root, so then it's as if it's a new tree. But if it grows out of the trunk, it's seen as an old tree. Okay, and we said, right, that the upper guy, as long as he can reach it, he can have it. However, the Gemara says you're not allowed to, hang from the tips of your toes in order to reach all the way down to get it. You have to be able to reach it in a normal way. And the Masechet ends with the Persian king, King Shapur, who says, I agree with this idea of Rabbi Shimon's, and he should be rewarded for his knowledge and his wisdom. And with that, we finish this Masechet. I wanna just tell you a beautiful idea that my husband either heard from someone else or made up. He's not sure, but I'm going to give him credit. We were talking about the upper garden and the lower garden, and we could think about it, more on a spiritual level, right? Are we people that get our nutrients from the upper, right, the things that are elevated, or do we get our nutrients, right? Are we sustained from the lower world? And I think that it's a beautiful idea to think about, right? Obviously, we get from both, and the question is what's primary, right? And therefore, right, the Mishnah says we see where you're growing from, right? Where do we grow from? If we grow from the upper world, so then that's what we belong to, even though our roots are in the ground. And I think it's really beautiful. And then the last idea is we said, right, wherever you can reach. And I think that that's another idea, right? Even if we are firmly rooted in the ground, it's important to reach for the sky, as they say. So with that, we finished the Masechet of Bava Metzia. I really hope all of you are going to celebrate with friends or family. You should have a party. It really is a huge accomplishment. 119 pages is not a small feat, and really, it's incredible. I think what I'll do is I'm going to stop the recording. I would love to hear some of your thoughts on learning this Masechet or something that you're taking away from this Masechet. So if you want to share for the last few minutes, I would love to hear that. So I'm just going to stop the recording. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and see you next week at the next Masechet. Don't forget to register. You have to register for the next Masechet, so don't forget to do that before next week. So looking forward to seeing you all next week.